We are back with another episode of App Stories, sponsored this week by App Figures, Things, and Pingdom. I'm John Voorhees, and I've got Federico Vitici with me. Hey, Federico, how you doing?
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. You know, this morning I woke up and I looked and I saw a tweet from Mac Rumors that said that WWDC was in a month, and instead of getting excited, I kind of panicked a little bit, I gotta say, because I realized that we're in that zone now of lots of things to get done and to do between now and the end of the year. But it is exciting. It's just we've got a few things going on, so I guess I didn't appreciate that reminder at the time it hit me before I had my first cup of coffee.
Yeah, I don't want to think about that for sure. It's already May 7th. Oh, wow, as we're recording this.
Yes, 30 days, Federico, 30 days as we record this.
Why'd you have to bring that up?
I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that to you. I know it's been a long week. But before we get to this topic, I guess we've got WWDC coming up. So we thought we would revisit our wishes for WWDC 2021, which is something that we've kind of made an annual thing now. And today we're going to cover macOS. But before we get to that, I wanted to kind of chat with you about a few things. The first is I want to get your take on the use of the term high-res audio versus lossless, because I'll tell you, every time I write about a service that claims to either be lossless or high resolution, I get corrected by a number of people on Twitter, as you know, people tend to do, especially audiophiles. And no matter which term I use, it's wrong to somebody. Do you have input on this? What I should use and what you think will solve this problem?
So I think my understanding, or at least the way I like to do it, the way I think about it, is lossless is CD quality. So in my mind, CD quality, so 16-bit, 4040 kilohertz sort of sound quality. That's the pretty standard CD quality sort of FLAC file that you get when you rip a CD. That to me is lossless. And by high res, I personally mean, and I also think other people mean, the official audio that gets the standard high res logo, which is a gold and black logo. So, and by high res, I think it means anything above CD quality.
Got it.
Right? So 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, that kind of stuff.
All right. I'm still learning. I actually don't think of CDs as lossless. I remember, this is going to age me, of course, but I remember when CDs were new and people complained bitterly about how digital they sounded.
Sure.
Just the way people complain about MP3s, but long before MP3s, at least were common. So, all right, that's helpful, Federico. I guess I have been misusing it here and there. I would like to also, I guess, follow out from your big reveal on Connected about Obsidian and that you've been using, because a lot of that was new to me too. I mean, I've picked up little bits of it here and there, and I've been using Obsidian myself. How's it going with Obsidian?
Well, it's going really well. It's definitely a journey. As I shared on Connected, the guys let me talk for 30 minutes, maybe more, about my Obsidian setup, and it's going really well. So the idea is that I'm unifying all kinds of writing and note-taking into Obsidian, because Obsidian, they are, I guess, about to release a mobile version for iPhone and iPad that is a full-on alternative to the desktop app. It's not a companion utility. It's got all the same features, including the ability to install custom plugins and themes and CSS snippets and all of that. And I think using Obsidian is, at least initially, is really about trying to understand all of these different options that you have.
Right.
And it's easy to get carried away and to install all the plugins that you can find and try all the different themes that you can find. And if anything, it's really an exercise in restraint, in trying to understand, okay, it's fun to fiddle, it's fun to play around with plugins, even the ones that I don't need, but what do I actually need from this app? And that's what I've been trying to nail down myself, trying to identify precisely what my needs are going to be in Obsidian going forward. And I think I'm especially trying to understand, thinking about, you mentioned that before, a month from now, iOS 15 and iPadOS 15 will be real. Right. And I will have to start the process of taking notes and gathering research material and start working on my iOS review for the year. And that's what I'm thinking about right now. How can I set this up in a way that is going to save me time and make me more productive and more efficient in the summer? And what are the different modifications, plugins and snippets? What are all these different things that I can create or that I can find if somebody else made them that will essentially give me the tools that I've always wanted to have in a text editor? And so it's easy to get, and I think it's only natural, at least initially, to get overwhelmed with all these different options that you get in Obsidian. But it's also fun to sit down, take a look at your workflow and say, okay, I need to figure out, for example, a better way to deal with image attachments. Or in my case, as I mentioned on Connected, a better way to deal with exporting Markdown and generating backups. Basically embedding tasks from my task manager into Obsidian, which is a thing that you can do. And so this is fun because it allows me to sort of take a look at myself from the outside and trying to catch myself doing things, a certain way, and realizing maybe there's a better way to do that, the thing that you just did, right?
Right.
And it's fun because I'm saving all of these ideas, and I've been collaborating with your son, Finn, on some of these ideas that I want to turn into plugins. It's a fun journey for sure.
Yeah, it really does sound like one, and I've barely scratched the surface compared to what you've been doing. But I've been resisting that urge too, to just kind of download a dozen different plugins and have them all installed at once. Instead, just started taking notes and writing in Obsidian without using plugins. And then when I kind of hit something that's a little bit of resistance, going back and looking at the plugins and seeing what is there that might make this experience better, and kind of taking it from that approach. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by App Figures. The developers out there probably already know App Figures for Analytics, which lets you see downloads, revenues, and store performance for all of your games and apps in one place. It's an indispensable tool for monitoring the performance of your apps. Here's the thing, though. With App Figures, you can also get more downloads with easy-to-use App Store optimization tools. More downloads and more sales helps you build a stronger, sustainable business. On top of that, App Figures also gives you competitive insights into how competing apps perform with app intelligence that reports downloads and revenue for the competition. Beyond the core tools, App Figures also offers tons of free guides and tutorials and hands-on learning materials so you can grow your downloads even if you're not sure how to get started. With all of this at a reasonable price, there's never been a better time to check out App Figures. Head on over to appfigures.com and try App Figures for free. If you like it, you can use our special code, AppStories3030, to get 30% off the next 3 months. That's a fantastic deal that not only will save you money, but will help you make more with your apps too. Once again, that's appfigures.com and the code AppStories3030 at checkout to get 30% off the next 3 months. App Figures, analytics, intelligence, and App Store optimization tools. Our thanks to App Figures for their support of the show. One thing I wanted to ask you about is your read later setup, because you touched on this on Connected, but it's not clear to me exactly what it is that you're doing now, because you mentioned that you've moved away from the Kobo ebook reader and back to the Kindle. Is that are you using that with Pocket, or are you using that with books and using something else for internet articles? What's kind of that whole thing look like?
So the Kindle is just for books. And it's just for books that you buy from Amazon, because there's a plugin called, I believe, Kindle Highlights that can automatically generate notes in Obsidian for highlights that you take in Kindle books. For internet articles, I'm using plain old Safari reading list because I built a shortcut that can do two things. First, when I'm reading a story and I want to save a highlight, the shortcut that I run actually highlights that passage of text on the web page. I use an orange highlight. That shortcut was put together using a bunch of JavaScript that can modify the contents of the page. So when I basically select anything on a web page and I run the shortcut, it visually highlights the thing that I just selected. So that when I'm reading a long form story, it's nice that I can scroll Safari. It never reloads the page and I never lose my position. So that when I'm reading a longer story, when I'm done, I can scroll through the whole story and I can actually see all of the highlights that I saved. However, the same shortcut actually also makes an API call to Readwise, so that the same highlight that is visually highlighted on the page is also saved as an article highlight in my Readwise account. Readwise is a service that can collect highlights from all kinds of sources. They have an API, they have Pocket integration, Instapaper integration, they have support for tweets, for Kindle, for really a bunch of different sources. And I saved those highlights to Readwise because later there's a different plugin that I'm using called Obsidian Readwise that I don't really have to remember to run because it runs automatically whenever I open Obsidian. It pulls those highlights from my account and it saves them as a text file. So one text file per article in a specific folder in my Obsidian database. And so that's a very nice way to end up with a collection of, the original URL, the title, the author, and plain text highlights saved in markdown text files, basically. And that is, in terms of data ownership, I think it's a very nice way because later in Obsidian, if I remember something, I can search very quickly for, say, the title of the story or the author or a sentence that I may remember from a highlight, and I can find that instantly in Obsidian. What's even nicer is that just today, I was actually playing around with this powerful Obsidian plugin called Data View. And this is one of those things that is possible because Obsidian is all based on web technologies, right? The page of the text editor in Obsidian is actually based on, CSS and HTML and JavaScript, basically. And Data View is this incredible plugin that lets you put together tables or lists by querying your Obsidian database for specific data points. And it sounds very complex. It's actually pretty easy when you look at the documentation. But basically, I showed you a screenshot just with, what is it? Like 4 lines of code. You can say data view. And in my case, I can say from the article folder, create a table with columns for author, name, date, and number of highlights.
Right.
And basically, this plugin goes into each text file, gets the appropriate fields. Maybe, John, we can put this in the show notes or as chapter art. I don't know, so people can get a sense of what it looks like.
Right.
And it generates a visual table for me, sorted by date, so that my latest articles are at the top of the table. And it shows me the title of the story, the domain, the date when I saved the article, and the number of highlights that I saved for each story, which is a very nice way to, to rediscover what you saved, because I think it's equally important to save as much as possible, to capture as much as possible, but I think it's also important to review what you captured and to have easy access to that information.
Right. Having a way to navigate is definitely important. One thing that I kind of wish Obsidian had, and maybe it's something that could work with a plugin, is the ability to search on just particular folders. Because right now I've got my archive of Mac Stories articles in there, and it kind of overwhelms everything else. Since I'm new to the app, I've only got so many new notes in there, but I've got hundreds of articles that I've written for the site, and I've been thinking about taking that archive of old articles out of there just because it's a little bit overwhelming when I'm trying to search. another thing I guess that came up on Connected was the UI of Obsidian and how it's not Mac-like on the Mac, and it's not iOS-like on iOS. No. And I mean, you can tweak that with themes and CSS snippets. One thing that I've been doing that I think people should keep in mind if they want to try out Obsidian is that you're not restricted to Obsidian, because since it's a folder of Markdown files, you can point any app at it that is able to do that. And I've been using iWriter to continue to do my writing, but those files are also being synced across all my devices via Obsidian. So now, whereas before I used to use GitHub to basically push my articles to various devices as I moved from one to another, now Obsidian is doing that syncing automatically, and I'm only pushing to GitHub as kind of a backup, or if I want to share it with somebody else like you, which I've actually kind of enjoyed doing that. The other thing I've been thinking about is whether there's a way to use GitHub as kind of making Obsidian a collaboration tool. It's not, real time by any stretch, but you could potentially share a set of data and push it back and forth between two people.
In theory, you could do that. It sure isn't real time. Yeah, you'd have to make sure that there's actual communication between the two people involved with that system, but I think it's definitely possible. Also on iOS, you can just point the Obsidian app to working copy, for example, and you can make that work. So in theory, that should totally be possible.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Things by Cultured Code. If you want to achieve a goal, you've got to have a plan. And when it comes to making a plan, there's no better tool than the award-winning app, Things. The idea behind Things is simple. Create a project for each of your goals, add the steps to reach those goals, and schedule when you want to work on them. Each morning when you wake up, Things has already prepared your list of to-dos for the day. Spend a few minutes reviewing the list, put your to-dos in the order you plan to work on them, and get on with your day. It doesn't matter which device you're on. Your to-dos sync through the cloud. They're always with you, on your computer, in your pocket, and on your wrist. You can also connect your calendars to see your events. Make to-dos repeat on a daily, weekly, monthly, or other schedule. Use widgets to see to-do lists on your home screen, and a whole lot more. But when it comes to Things, what you'll love more than anything else is the app's beautiful design. It doesn't just look good, it feels good to use. It's made to an incredibly high standard of quality. It's even won an Apple Design Award twice. So, if you haven't tried Things recently, you really should. Head on over to the website at thingsapp.com. Again, that's thingsapp.com to learn more about the great features of Things. You can download a free trial on your Mac. You can also find it in the App Store simply by searching for Things. Whatever it is you want to accomplish in life, Things can help you get there. Try Things today at thingsapp.com. You won't regret it. Our thanks to Things by Cultured Code for their support of the show. All right, Federico, why don't we move on to our main topic for today, which is macOS, which we'll be getting at WWDC, at least getting a preview of and a beta of. And, I guess we ought to start big picture, because I wrote about this a little bit for the club. I would be okay if there aren't a lot of big features in this release, because I feel like even though Big Sur is a big improvement over Catalina in terms of stability, there's still some annoying bugs in the system. Things like Bluetooth, especially on the M1 Max, although I don't think it's limited to the M1 Max, although that's often hard to tell because it could be the Bluetooth device that's causing trouble and not the OS. But besides Bluetooth, the Finder, which I had to restart probably 3 or 4 times this week, which isn't a whole lot of fun. There's weird stuff going on there. I'd like to see Apple spend some time digging into these lower level things and making the system more stable, and then refining some of the things we got with Big Sur. So under the hood, I don't want to get into all the bugs that I've run into over the course of the year, because they're different from me from other people, but I've heard enough noise from people who are dissatisfied with the stability of Big Sur that I do think that merits some looking at and some work on. Refinements are things like, I mean, we'll get to the big ticket items, but refinements are things like Control Center and notifications. And I know that you had some thoughts about Control Center. What would you like to see come to that?
Yeah, so obviously I don't think, ideally I would like to have this totally custom menu bar. Basically, my dream is that Apple buys Bartender and it makes it like a native feature of macOS that gives you total control over the menu bar and all the different things that you can have in the,
right.
in the macOS menu bar to the extent that Bartender does. But I don't think they're ever going to do that. So personally, with regards to Control Center, I really would like to have, and this applies both to macOS and iOS. It's one of those things that if Apple does it, I think it should be cross-platform. Third-party Control Center utilities. So to have toggles or quick menus or, one-tap launchers in Control Center made by third-party developers. And it could be, I guess on macOS and on iPad, it should work in a couple of different ways. Or maybe the Control Center UI could be unified across platforms, because right now it's kind of similar but different between devices. I just would love to have third-party utilities in there. And when I mentioned unification, that also applies to things like on the Mac. I discovered, thanks to your review, by the way, back in back in 2020, that you can essentially take certain system toggles out of Control Center and put them in the menu bar as like standalone accessories. And in my mind, that should also be the case for third-party utilities, and it should also work on iPad. I really think I would love to see, the iPad gain some kind of menu bar system that is kind of similar to the Mac. Because I feel like with third-party Control Center utilities, if Apple opens it up to third-party developers, and if those Control Center utilities can be taken out of Control Center, then I guess Apple is sort of, at that point, they would be reinventing menu bar apps altogether, right? Which I think is also something that they should do, because right now, basically, the menu bar ecosystem on the Mac, it's a sort of Wild West, right? Everybody does it in a different way. There's the fantastical thing that looks a certain way, and Dropbox has its own menu bar app. And, some apps have native menus, other apps have custom UIs. I think I could use better consistency in the macOS menu bar, maybe an API that works across platforms and that also integrates with Control Center. That could be an idea.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think if they do standardize it like that, though, you'd probably end up with some of your favorites that are somehow worse afterwards, a little bit like what happened with widgets, right? Because by standardizing things, oftentimes that means you're restricting somebody who's doing something creative. But I do feel kind of the same, that there is such a variety that it'd be nice if there was a little bit more uniformity. The other thing, there are a couple other things that are just, I feel like both Control Center, and we'll get to Notification Center in a minute, but both of them felt very 1.0 to me, in the sense that they don't do a lot of things that you can already do on iPadOS and iOS. Like Control Center, for instance, you can't rearrange those icons, and you can't, you can pick and choose which are in there, but you can't really move things around. And as a result, it's pretty inflexible, and there's so many things that are kind of missing there. I feel like there are other things that you could add to that from the system preferences. Maybe things like access to your scanners or printers or other peripheral type stuff would be good as well as third-party stuff. And, the other thing is that the Control Center doesn't even have a keyboard shortcut, which, thank goodness, Bartender comes to the rescue on that as well. You can assign a hotkey for the Control Center, which I've done, and it's great. But that's really something that you shouldn't have to rely on Bartender for, as good as the app is. It's something that should be just built into the system. So it's just one of those things where, I actually kind of like Control Center. I especially like what was done with music. I like the fact that in a way it's kind of a simplified version of Bartender. I mean, power users are going to want to use Bartender anyway because they've got so many apps installed. But Bartender does solve the problem probably for most people because not Bartender. I'm sorry. Control Center solves the problem for most people because it moves enough things out of the menu bar that they're not colliding with the menu system if you're on a smaller laptop. So I think it's a good default solution for that, but I'm glad that Bartender exists, and I do think Apple needs to take it a little bit further.
Yeah. John, let me ask you this. Have you ever tried to manage notifications on the Mac?
I do, in the sense that sometimes when I carve back notifications. I mean, I've got too many, they'll get to be too many. So I'll turn notifications off a lot of things. I don't go into the notification center very much.
Right.
And part of the problem, I think the idea was instead of having this, there used to be a segmented control up top that switched between, your widgets and your notifications. And this has been consolidated into one thing, and it's one column. And I just feel like it doesn't work very well. And that, we can talk about widgets on the desktop, but I think widgets need to move out of Notification Center altogether, and Notification Center just needs to be Notification Center, because even with the way there's the ability to expand the Notification Center or expand particular stacks of notifications, it's a little crowded in there, especially if you don't go through the system preferences and turn a lot of things off. And I don't know, it's very hidden behind the clock, which makes no sense to me. I do feel like it probably needs it really should have its own widget in Control Center maybe, or a menu bar item, or both. And I'd like to have the full length of the screen available for my notifications, just so that if I've been away for a long time and I have a bunch of email messages that came in, I can click on it once and see a whole bunch of them. And you can kind of do that now, but I feel like it's a little too crowded with the widgets underneath them. And I really don't use the widgets ever because they're so hidden away.
Yeah, I really don't understand what they were thinking when they designed this new notification and widget page on macOS. So notifications, I find them very slow and clunky to manage on macOS. On an iPhone and iPad, you can easily swipe a bunch of grouped notifications away. And on the Mac, you gotta hit this tiny X icon in the top left corner of a notification, which I find very slow and kind of slow to operate really from the trackpad. And the widgets, they live in there, but they are like underneath notifications, and you cannot drag them to the desktop at all. Like, you can grab a widget and you can drag it around the screen, but then as soon as you let go of the cursor, it snaps back into this overlay that basically it reminds me of the iPad. So when you go to the iPad home screen and you rotate the iPad in portrait, widgets become this overlay that you gotta swipe from the left edge of the screen to view those widgets. And it's kind of similar to the Mac, where you press the date and time button, which I don't understand. Why is the clock the point of activation for widgets? I don't get it. And they come in as overlays. So at this point, I kind of have to say that I sort of preferred the old dashboard system. I mean, at the very least, you could press a button on your keyboard and you would get this special view full of widgets that was actually kind of fun to play around with. And you could rearrange them, you could move them around, and you could interact with them. These widgets, they are stuck in an overlay that you activate by pressing the clock, which I always forget that it's the thing you're supposed to do. They're non-interactive because they're based on the same WidgetKit framework of iOS, and I find them pretty much useless. So for macOS 12, I've loved the ability to have more freedom regarding the placement of widgets on macOS, but really I hope that version 2 of WidgetKit introduces some kind of basic user interaction instead of just going all in on glanceability. I would love if I could, scroll widgets or tap them and make something happen in line within the widget.
Right. I agree. And, I feel like there's room to move these onto the desktop too, just like there is on iPadOS, in that, with macOS, I forget whether it's 2 or 3 years ago, we got stacks where you can, even if you are one of those people who has a bunch of files and folders sitting on their desktop temporarily, supposedly, right? You can have them stacked up where the pictures are together and the movies are together and the text documents are together. And that frees up and organizes the desktop in a way that leaves plenty of room, I think, for most people to include widgets on that desktop too. And given that Apple did that kind of automatic tidying up, it has that feature in macOS now, it feels like the kind of thing that was almost designed to free up space for widgets to be on the desktop. They just aren't yet. So I really would like to see them come to the desktop in 2021. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pingdom from SolarWinds. Today's internet users expect a fast web experience. No matter how targeted your marketing content or how sleek your website is, they'll bounce if a page isn't loading fast enough. But with real user monitoring from Pingdom, you can discover how website performance affects your visitors' experience. So you can take action before your business is impacted, all for as low as $10 per month. Whether your visitors are dispersed around the world or across browsers, devices, and platforms, Pingdom helps you identify bottlenecks, troubleshoot performance, and make informed optimizations. Real user monitoring is an event-based solution, so it's built for scalability. This means you can monitor millions of page views, not just sample data, at an affordable price. Get live site performance visibility today with real user monitoring from Pingdom. Go to pingdom.com/signup right now for a 30-day free trial with no credit card required. When you're ready to buy, use the code AppStories at checkout to get an awesome 30% off your first invoice. Again, that URL is pingdom.com/signup for a 30-day free trial with no credit card and the code AppStories to get 30% off your first invoice when you're ready to buy. Thanks to Pingdom from SolarWinds for their support of App Stories. All right, Federico, why don't we move on to multitasking? Because I know you've got some ideas there, because obviously we'll have more to talk about with multitasking when it comes to iPadOS. But I know from your experience using the iPad, you have some thoughts on how that could work on the Mac too. And I'm right there with you on these.
Mm-hmm. So when I work on the Mac, I'm really not a fan of freely resizable windows.
Mm-hmm.
What I find myself doing most of the time is rely on the functionality enabled by Better Touch Tool, which is this incredible desktop utility to modify all kinds of system settings on macOS. I rely on that to unlock, I call it snap style or Windows style multitasking, which basically means I just want to grab a window by the title bar, drag it, just casually drag it to the side of the screen. And when I do that, the window snaps to fill half of the display.
Right.
Whereas if I drag it to the top, it maximizes its, UI Chrome to fill the entire display. And if I drag it to the right, it fills the right side. This is what I want to do on the Mac. I don't want to grab a window by its tiny corner and use the arrow, thing to precisely realize a window to fill a small portion of the screen. Mm-hmm. I just want to grab a bunch of stuff and sort of, throw it around the display and have this overlay that previews the size of the window and then let go and it snaps. And I can do that with 2 or 3 windows and I can go boom, boom, boom. And I got, 3 windows on the screen and it's done. This is what I want from macOS multitasking. Just make it easier to have multi-window setups without having to do the manual resizing yourself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't like tediously resizing windows either. And as a result, my desktop is often kind of cluttered. And I use Better touch tool for that as well. There are tons of other apps that do this. There's Magnet, Moom, a whole bunch of others that have done this kind of thing. Better touch tool for me works because I use it for other reasons as well. But it feels like the kind of thing that it's time to bring to the system as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, you can do this in theory. I don't know for how long you've been able to do this, but if you long press on the green button in the traffic light controls on a macOS window, you have those options for tile window to the left or tile window to the right, which is sort of what I'm suggesting. The problem with this is that if you use that native feature, you enter full screen mode. And full screen mode is one of the most confusing things I've ever tried on a computer.
I really don't like it very much.
It takes you out into a separate space and you don't see the dock anymore. And if you want to, say, grab a file from the Finder, it kicks you back to the desktop. It's super confusing. I just want to, stay on my main desktop. I don't have multiple spaces. I have one desktop. I just want to stay there and take a window, tile to the left, take the other, tile to the right, without having to go into full screen mode. And for that, I got to use Better Touch Tool right now.
Right. And just the act of having to hit the little green button and hold down your mouse button or your trackpad for a while to get it. That's not a good experience to begin with.
Yeah.
All right. Let's move from the system to some of the core apps because, despite all the alignment between the iPad and the Mac recently, there's still room to improve here. And boy, the one that I will mention every time we talk about this until they're on an even playing field is music, because just this morning before we recorded, I was using music and I just couldn't get into the Listen Now view, and I don't know what was going on there. It was a bug. It was not loading. I have no idea what was going on, and I feel like music, which is still an AppKit app, has a lot of that legacy code from iTunes still under the hood, which I don't think has served it very well. I understand why Apple did it, because there are certain features that Mac users expect from their media player, from their music player, that just wouldn't otherwise be available. But it is a little clunky still in terms of the bugs, and it just never has really it's never really been fully integrated with things like the continuity features, whether it's handoff or Siri or whatever it is. Because, one of the things I think about is like, I'll start some music playing at my desk, and then maybe I'll go upstairs, and I only mean to go up for a minute or two, but I realize, I've got a couple of things I need to do in the kitchen. So I'd like to be able to just, tell Siri on my HomePod to transfer the music from my Mac to my HomePods in my living room. But you can't do that because that's just not how it works. I mean, I can AirPlay from my Mac all over my house, but I can't move that music from one place to another. And that I find frustrating. It bugs me at least a couple of times a week. And that it just feels like music really needs to be better integrated on the Mac.
All right, what do you have on your list, John? You're the Mac user. Come on, you must have a few more things for me.
I do. I have books because the Books app. Boy, we wrote about this now like 3 years ago, maybe.
Oh, yeah, that was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago that Books got a really big upgrade on the iPhone and iPad, and I get it. Most people are reading on those devices and not on their Mac, but Apple also promotes books as something for students and professionals and people who might be looking at reference materials, whether that's a book about coding or maybe your textbook if you're a student, whatever it is. And the experience of books on the Mac is not very good. It didn't get the upgrade that iOS saw. When audiobooks was added to books, I guess it was last year, it was just kind of bolted on. There was a little space in the sidebar, so they tacked it onto the bottom of the sidebar on the left, which doesn't look very good, but it works. I would like to see it just get a complete design overhaul. And really, I don't know why it's not. It should be near the top of the list for a Catalyst conversion, I think, because you're not creating a lot of content in books. Maybe you're highlighting things and taking notes, that sort of thing. But for the most part, it's just a viewer app. And Apple's already migrated a bunch of viewer type apps to Catalyst, and I think it's Books' turn now. speaking, I guess, of Catalyst 2, I'm really happy with how far Catalyst has come, but it's one of those things where it's still got room to grow and room to evolve, because there are still things that I hear from developers that are just too hard to do, coming from the iOS side of things. And so that kind of comes into under the heading of refinements and under the hood stuff, where it's okay if there's not a huge number of new features from Apple's apps, as long as it makes the company makes it easier for third-party developers to bring all of their feature sets from their apps on the iPad to the Mac. That's something that I'd really like to see.
Yeah. Is it too much to ask for some kind of sign of life in Safari reading list? Is that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious from you, since you just gone back to it recently, and it's been a while since I've used it. What kinds of things would you like to see? I know I'd like to see, simple things like either folders or tagging.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the simple things, right? I mean, folders, tagging, automatic organization by domain, for example. This is something that Reader does, right? The Reader has a special view where you can see, say, all stories from 9to5mac.com or macstories.net, that kind of filtering system.
Right.
Just, anything could work. I mean, my dream is to actually have like a dedicated, reading list app made by Apple, like that is integrated with Safari, but that also lives outside of Safari. I don't know. I guess maybe just something more. Right now, reading list is not even its own standalone view in Safari.
Right.
Reading list is like a section of the bookmarks sidebar.
I know,
so
it's a weird little panel.
Sidebar is this small panel that you need to switch between bookmarks, history, and reading list, I believe. And reading list is just right there, sort of hiding. It's like, hey guys, I haven't been updated in 7 years. I hope they don't get rid of me. I don't know.
It's too bad, because I think that Safari does a fantastic job with things like the reader view. I mean, it's a great reading experience. It just needs a little more structure around what you save, because it's just one long list that gets out of hand very quickly if you're doing the kind of link saving that we do. And I think, obviously it's our job to do that, and we probably do that more than a lot of people, but I think that there are an awful lot of people who read a lot on the web, and that it would benefit more than just people writing for a living. So,
I mean, I would be surprised if Apple engineers having spent a lot of time at home over the past year, I'm guessing that they got some reading done, because we all had a lot of free time, especially last year. I mean, you must have noticed, right? That reading list, could use a lot of work.
Yeah, so, I actually cleaned mine out completely the other day in anticipation of getting your shortcut at some point and giving it a try. So I'm
still gotta
fresh.
Clean mine. I have stories from 2017 in there at the bottom of the list. That
mine were all at least 2 years old, or else sometimes they're things that I accidentally saved to reading list, which is far too easy to do sometimes too.
Yeah.
I guess one other thing which I don't hold out a lot of hope for in the refinements category is I'd really like to see some sort of basic troubleshooting tool for iCloud, because probably there's no more frustrating thing on any Apple device than having some sort of problem with iCloud where it's not syncing properly, and you have no idea what's going on because it's just a black box. You don't know which device it is that's causing the trouble. And, sometimes the answer is, well, just log out everywhere and, blow everything away except for the version that the device where you think the data is the best, and then rebuild it from scratch from the ground up, which isn't a very good suggestion, because one, so many things rely on being logged into your Apple ID that you cause a lot of knock-on effects when you log out of your Apple ID, and then you have those things to deal with as well. Plus, it takes a long time for some of these apps to propagate from one device to another. So it's very easy to get in a situation where you turn syncing back on a particular device, and you think it's still broken, but it's not really, because it'll show up in I don't know, a couple hours, a few hours, whatever it happens to be. And so, as a result, a lot of the time I just leave those problems in place and hope that they'll go away, because a lot of times they just do. It's like some kind of weird network thing, or maybe an upgrade to an OS fixes them as well. But every now and then, you'll realize, oh, I have 5 fewer shortcuts on my iPad than my iPhone, or I have 700 contacts on this
Yes.
Mac, but 720 on this other one. And you're like, well, you wonder, well, is the 720 the right one, or is it you just don't know, because you don't notice these things right away, especially I think with apps like, especially contacts, where I don't know about you, but
it's shortcuts for me.
Yeah, I don't go into those. I don't go into contacts, for instance, very often, because I just don't need to, because most email just auto completes and that sort of thing.
Because when you do, you realize you have contacts that are not syncing. At least
right,
that's always the case for me.
Exactly. Or else somehow you ended up with multiples, and it's like, well, are there multiples because Siri was being helpful in adding this person a second time, or are there multiples because they're duplicating? It's just not clear, and I'd like to see some tools built around this to kind of help people troubleshoot this stuff.
I can't believe we saved possibly the most important one for last.
Yes, this is a very important one, and it's a one that I think that you and I are on the same page with, and I know Jason Snell just wrote about this too, and I did for the club, which is, if there is one brand new feature to the Mac that I'd like to see come this year, it's shortcuts.
Yes, shortcuts on the Mac, and along with it, a new unified vision for automation on the desktop and automation on Apple platforms in general. This is something that Jason suggested in last week's issue of Mac Stories Weekly, where we interviewed Jason about his writing setup and all these different markdown automations. But yes, on the Mac, it makes sense, right? On the Mac, there's a bunch of different tools for automation. There's AppleScript, there's Automator, obviously, which is sort of the grandfather of shortcuts, you could say. There's JavaScript for automation, which is another technology that Apple released years ago and that never really took off. I think shortcuts makes a lot more sense than all of these other things, especially because it found success on iOS and iPadOS, and because there's an ecosystem of apps that integrate with shortcuts, and also because shortcuts works directly with Siri. There's, actually, I want to be that guy. Actually, parts of shortcuts are already available on macOS.
They are.
Because if you open the Home app and you try to put together a custom home automation, that is the Shortcuts UI, right? It's available on the Mac. It's the subset of the Shortcuts editor that works with HomeKit automations. So on the Mac, I wouldn't just want to see like a straight up Catalyst version of shortcuts. I think it's going to be that, but I also hope that Apple takes its time to understand the different nature of the Mac and build new shortcuts integrations designed specifically for the Mac. I'm thinking of things like Finder integration, right? Have a proper solution for folder actions, for example. Allow users to replace utilities or to maybe complement utilities like Hazel using shortcuts. Mm-hmm. Imagine if you could have a shortcut integration on the Mac where you could point it at a folder, set up a bunch of rules, and execute actions whenever something happens in that folder. Basically Hazel, but done in shortcuts. Or imagine if you could have something that we also are wishing for on iPad, system-wide keyboard activation for your shortcuts. Yep. Assign a keyboard shortcut to a shortcut. Yeah, and it's confusing because everything is called a shortcut.
Right.
But imagine assign a hotkey to one of your shortcuts, and you press it. No matter what you're doing on your computer, the shortcut runs. Ideally, without showing you a notification, because those notifications are so annoying. Please, Apple,
really
let us get rid of them. And then we could go deeper, right? We could say, well, what if on the Mac shortcuts could invoke AppleScript? What if on the Mac shortcuts could run shell scripts? All those kinds of ideas. I'm really keen to see what Apple does with shortcuts. I would be honestly shocked if shortcuts doesn't come to the Mac this year, but I want to see just how far they take it. in terms of adapting shortcuts to macOS.
Right. And look, I would really like to see shortcuts become the glue that helps bring all of the OSs together too, not just automating things on a system or app level on the Mac, but also integrating and interacting with apps on iOS back and forth in both directions. Because, some of these things are kind of possible now, especially with, SSH and that sort of thing, but that's too difficult for the common user, I think. And, AppleScript and Automator hasn't really been touched much in recent years. AppleScript is a little different depending on which app you're using, and so it's a little hard to get your hands around. It's not super well documented for a lot of apps. I feel like, I'm not suggesting that shortcuts should come in and take away all of these existing things. They should integrate with them. But I think that shortcuts has a familiarity on the iOS and iPadOS side and has a simplicity of implementation that is more approachable and would bring more people into automation on the Mac. I know that sometimes when I say that shortcuts should come on the Mac, people get upset that I'm saying that Keyboard Maestro isn't good enough, or Better Touch Tool isn't good enough, or Hazel isn't good enough, or those things should be replaced. And I don't mean to suggest that at all, because I use all those tools and I think they're great. But they're also, it's a problem, I think, that there has to be so many different apps to accomplish so many different things. Those are all good apps at what they do, but they all do different things. And I'd like to see shortcuts come in and at least take that base layer of common actions that people do, whether it's moving a file from one folder to the other, or saving a web page as a link in a text document. Things like that can be accomplished by more people more easily on the Mac and cross over to iOS and make the two systems work better together.
Yeah.
All right, Federico, that's a good episode. We'll have more episodes. We've got, of course, things like the good old iPadOS to deal with and iOS, but we thought we'd start today with the Mac. I want to thank our three sponsors again for this episode: AppFigures, Things, and Pingdom. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram too, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.